Asmau Ahmed is a longtime business executive, predominantly in the banking industry, although she's also a serial entrepreneur. She is currently a senior executive at a major global bank, which we're not going to talk about, but her career has mostly been working around digital innovation in one way or another. She started a company called Plum Perfect, which helps beauty brands better reach people of color and help them find what they really need. She now has started a company called Diversity Meter, we're going to hear a lot about. She is a Nigerian native who traveled around a ton because her mother is a diplomat. She's a super global person, but now very much living in the United States and understands the problems and the challenges and the opportunities we have here, which I think will be informing a lot of our discussion. So welcome, Asmau. So the title of the session was how data and tech can diversify networks. So I wanted to start by asking you that general question. Is that what you believe, and why?
It is absolutely what I believe, particularly in this day and age, right? If you look at our ecosystem, we're already digitally native, right? We're comfortable interacting with people online. And when I also think about our quest for equity and what has been done in the past, the tools and resources we've used, we've pretty much done everything. We've educated, there's been protests and marches and civil wars and laws have changed. But the one tool that I feel is completely unutilized, and it just makes perfect sense to me and honestly boggles my mind as to why we're not doing more of this, is technology and data, right? When I think about how our digital footprints, right, and what we use technology and data for, we have diverse sales pipelines. If, retailer, I won't name anybody, but if retailer ABC wanted to target me for a certain product that was geared towards Black women, they would find me, right? And that's as a result of, highly targeted algorithms that can find me today. And I wonder, why aren't we doing the same things when we're looking at opportunity pipelines for jobs, right? So yes, it is absolutely my belief that now is the time, because we're all digitally native, particularly now in COVID times. We have the technology to do this work, right? To help diversify networks. And I believe, so here's the part that I think will be somewhat of an experiment, is that do we have the human will? Because even with the technology, we need humans to take action. So do we have enough of the majority willing to do something about equity in order for this to work? So that's the question.
So, well, let's talk about what this is in the case of your current project. What is Diversity Meter and how did you come to create it?
So an interesting story. The Diversity Meter was actually built a few years ago, and it was inspired by my son. My son is autistic. I would describe him as profoundly autistic. And I had a really, really tough time getting him integrated into schools or camps. And just the way he presented was just very different than what people would presume his natural abilities were. And I knew I wasn't going to change the system. I wasn't going to change the school system. I certainly couldn't influence, policy when it came to this. So I decided to take a micro approach, which was, how do I convince other typical children and their parents that including my son was as much beneficial to them as it was to him, right? And that way, at least I could set up an after-school program in my home and get people to connect. And naturally, I began thinking about parallels with my own life. Now, I've lived in New York, for almost 20 years. And I thought about, I'm a Black woman, immigrant, Muslim, the list goes on. And I began drawing parallels with, I live in this really diverse city, yet my network mostly looks like me, right? My network is mostly Black, mostly women of color, mostly immigrant. And so how can I expand, one, take the onus on myself to expand my inner circle, but also convince others outside of my network to include me, right? And so that was the notion of the diversity meter. And I began building it 3 years ago. So the diversity meter actually not only started with neurodiversity with my son, and then expanded into 13 different attributes: race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, political affiliation. And how it works is that it would first tell you how diverse your current network is, right? So most people don't know that, and that's a problem. I think in our first conversation, David, I asked you how diverse is your network, right? And most people have kind of an abstract view of what that may look like maybe, but we don't really know. So we'll do that. And then once we figure out where the gaps are, then we build a recommendation engine and a machine learning algorithm that helps you actually diversify your network with meaningful connections, people that you really want to meet, right? So people aligned with your industry, people aligned with your function, people with common interests. But diversity, those 13 different attributes, will be at the core of those connections. But to what end is all of this, right? For my son, it was getting him, integrated into a school setting. The first use case of this is going to be democratizing access to jobs, right? So when you connect with those people, we're also, one criteria for connection is what can you give and what can you get, and what is that opportunity timing, right? So once you connect with people, the goal is that you now begin building referral pipelines into companies, right? So that's how it works.
So you're able to do this partly because social media and other public data sources or semi-public data sources give you the ability, even for individuals, to have some kind of digital proxy for their actual human network. Is that a fair summary?
And that is a fair summary. Yes, we're able to do this because we already have a digital footprint. So we use a combination of computer vision technology, right? But we need every user's permission, right, to actually access their data. So we do some things the old-fashioned way, right? Tell us what your diverse attributes are. But most of this information we're actually it's already out there. I think we have this false notion of privacy, right? The information we get has to be user approved, right? We have to get the consent of the user. But a lot of the information that we use already exists. So we would love to build partnerships with existing social media platforms already to get access to all of that data.
And as someone who spent most of your career inside large global companies, or certainly large American companies, some of them very global,
Right.
where another form of network is the senior leadership, as middle leadership, middle management, all the different layers of these companies. How could a tool like this be applied there, and how determined are you that it is absolutely necessary that something like this should be applied in those companies generally? Not so much the ones you work in, but the average
Right.
American big company.
Yeah, I think every corporation, how many corporations, at least 70 large Fortune 500 companies, I believe, don't quote me on this, have made statements about inclusion, right? And some of them have actually set public diversity targets. And a lot of them have missed those targets year after year. And that's because they're using the same tactics that they've always used in the past. I mean, we've heard news that, and this isn't a new belief, but a lot of people believe this is a pipeline issue, right? As to why they're not achieving their diversity goals. And I want to challenge that because I don't believe that's true. I think it's absolutely critical for corporate America to mobilize its employee base, every willing employee within their organization to take it upon themselves to diversify their networks and build this multiple referral pipelines into the company. So what we're doing now is we're heavily reliant on our recruiting teams, right, which are limited in resources, certainly limited in speed and scale, to go out there, work with colleges and universities, work with affiliate organizations, do a lot of manual groundwork and labor, only to target the same people, their competitors are targeting, right? I can speak, for myself and for people in my network to say that this past year feels like a year where, as women of color and people of color, we're generally seen now more than we have been, our entire careers. And that's because of a fundamental shift in awareness. I think now is a critical time where we take what hasn't been working and we expand it, right? So what this allows corporations to do is to enable every willing person within their company to become that referral pipeline for diverse talent into the company. Does that make sense?
Sure, and historically, referrals have been a huge tool, maybe one of the central tools, but they tend to reinforce existing demographics in effect. So
right.
You're thinking there is a data-centric way to bypass that or to augment that in a very effective way. One of the things I wanted to ask you about that I know you have strong opinions about is the personal cost that people pay by not having more diverse networks in our lives and in our work.
Yes, I do feel very strongly about this, as you know, from previous conversations. I recently, I'll share a recent conversation I had. I recently had a conversation with a gentleman who I'll call Bob, that said to me, in order for this to work, and this is true, in order for this to work, we need the majority to actually believe that diversity is important and to do something about it. Now, the personal cost that we pay is that we don't have a diversity of opinions, of thought, of creativity around the table. And that does affect our bottom line as a company. Oftentimes, people use the words diversity of thought loosely. I think your thoughts are directly correlated to your identity. So my thoughts are influenced by the fact that I am a Black woman, immigrant, Muslim, all of those things, mom of an autistic child. And when we're living today in the digital world, in a global world, most of our customers are diverse. And in order to really connect with our customers, we have to think like them. And if you don't have that representation within corporate America, I think that's a huge, huge disadvantage, right? And also from a personal perspective, the news that we hear, right? And social media just reinforces the like follows like, right? I actually did this exercise when I went and I looked at my entire LinkedIn profile. I looked at my Instagram followers, the people I followed, and most of them look like I do and have the same beliefs I do. So I live in this echo chamber, right? And most of us do. And if we're really going to live in a global world, right? If we're really going to understand our neighbors and the people we live with, I think it is imperative upon all of us to take the onus upon ourselves to diversify our networks.
And do you think that maybe this past year, people like you're saying have more visibility, which has been a very positive outcome of a very painful year. But do you think that, the average, let's say, white male leader of a business or middle manager or senior manager, do you sense an attitude shift happening enough? I mean, I don't think we're nearly far along enough with that, but give me your thoughts on what needs to happen with the sort of psychology of society and business.
So I think the answer is yes. I do definitely see a shift. I think there is a heightened awareness about what's going on in our society and about the inequity and how pervasive it has been, right? A lot of people were not aware of that. And honestly, because I was so hyper aware of it all of the time, it was surprising to me, as I'm sure you've heard, how unaware others were. However, yes, there's an absolute shift. I think of it as a bell curve, right? I think that you have the fringes, right? Where on one extreme, you have the people that will never get educated, right? And no matter what's done, they just, I think of that as that's just never going to change, right? They'll never do anything. Their mindset remains what it is. And then you have people on the other end that I call activists, and they don't need the incentive or the tools to do something. They just go out and they do things, right? But I think the majority sit in the middle, where awareness is heightened. They generally believe in the values and of diversity and inclusion, but they're still comfortable. Right?
Yeah.
And unless there was a tool that they could leverage to actually inspire change, they may not do anything, right?
Yeah.
And so those are my views. I think there's definitely heightened awareness. There's definitely more conversations. I want conversations. And that's why I think technology and data is such a powerful tool to use right now, because it's something that we use natively and inherently. Is just part of our habit. If we're able to build a tool around helping us to connect and build diverse networks in a way that's meaningful, right? The reason we started jobs is that it would help build economic empowerment for underrepresented people, for marginalized communities, and that's the quickest way to just, elevate these communities. So yes, I think there's a heightened awareness. I just think people need that extra push to actually do something.
Yeah, actually, Michelle Clark in the Q&A has a question, a comment, sort of question-ish comment. We need a shift in the psychology of success. If white men believe they will be more successful if they continue to ignore diversity, they'll continue to ignore it. But before you even answer that, I'll just tell you something I was thinking as you were speaking. The idea of white privilege, for example, that's been around for a long time. People who were sort of consciously trying to think about this stuff were aware of it. But until fairly recently, it wasn't in the common parlance. But today, even people who reject it as a concept are aware of the concept. And that is quite a step forward in itself, I would say. But what do you think about Michelle's comments?
I've always talked about this notion of white success versus other success, right? I agree. I'll say it a little differently, right? I think if people continue to believe that the success of other is kind of here, right, and the success of the majority is here, right, then we're not going to go anywhere, right? So I think what we need is just a truly level playing field where somebody that looks like me can be seen as, the CEO of Google, for example. That needs to happen in order for there to be a significant shift in action and intent.
What's interesting is that it's true in the micro and the macro. I mean, this is very connected to something Dambisa Moyo was saying yesterday, which I have been a firm believer in. Techonomy's talked about for years, that if the whole world doesn't come up, even Americans are going to suffer. So it's true at the macro level. And being a Nigerian yourself, you're Nigerian American, you understand that. It happens that I once lived in Nigeria myself, so I have a little bit of an insight into that. But you have got a company, you've got a technology built. Talk about where Diversity Meter stands. I know it's still sort of not launched, but and how much hardcore tech does it take to do this? And just what should we expect next from Diversity Meter?
So it hasn't launched yet. We're hoping to launch in the fall. We need actually more than one. We need a few corporate partners to launch this with. The technology is built. And I utilize my experience building computer vision technologies, building machine learning algorithms and recommendation engines and hyper-personalized marketing advertising tools to do this. And we filed a patent on it. So the technology is solid. However, I will say this, that it is technology that is evolving and readily available. And so, while its application here is unique and different, It's something that we absolutely could have done if our priorities were right, 5 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
And Plum Perfect may have, I presume, used computer vision technology too.
Yes.
Did that? Yeah. Well, and finally, maybe just, I had hoped we'd talk a little more about the personal challenges you've experienced as a Black woman entrepreneur, an immigrant Muslim woman entrepreneur. Any thoughts on that you think our audience needs to understand that might have informed where you are in your career and your vision of what we all need to be thinking about?
Sure. I came here for college, and while I knew that the color of my skin was Black, this was the first, being here in the US was the first time I truly identified as Black and what it means to be Black in the US. It was the first time that I knew that assumptions were associated with the color of my skin. Truly, I was truly really naive about this until I couldn't be anymore. And I started noticing this notion of Black success, right? It was almost of, why aren't you satisfied? You're doing well. Why, as a Black woman, so as a Black woman, you're doing really well. Why do you want more? And it was at a time where I felt unfulfilled in my career, unfulfilled in my success, and I wanted more. And my more wasn't limited by the color of my skin. So I think that immigrant perspective, with it honestly comes the privilege of kind of being fearless, and knowing what the possibility was beyond the constraints of society, right? I refused to be labeled as Black woman, or refused to be constrained by what Black success meant in comparison to others. So that's kind of, I think that's what has driven me and sustained me. And I think of my children, I want that same spirit, because I really do think it was an advantage for me, not having, for the first 17 years of my life, not having that, belief or that constraint remotely in my purview.
That's really a good thing to say. That great novel Americana, written by a Nigerian, yes, about an experience of a Nigerian coming to the United States, has some of that same concept in it. Right. Thank you so much for being here, Asmau. Want to stay in close touch. We are, like you, great believers at Techonomy in the potential of technology to help us address some of these big systemic problems and opportunities. So
thanks so much for having me, David. Absolutely.